Boker Tov.
They do. At the Shangri-La, they say Shabbat Shabbat.
Any coolies pulling you around town?
I don't think that's it.
Page 124, Parshat Toldos. Parshat Toldos. Today, the main topic, our discussion, is children living in the shadow of their parents or of their father or mother, and how different people react in such realities. That's going to be the main focus. Briefly, we are familiar with this parsha. We know we ended last week with a shidduch between Yitzchak, patriarch number 2, with Rivka, matriarch number 2. There is a difficulty with conceiving. They go for prayer, they pray, she gets a prophecy / prediction, not one but 2 children, and they're going to go in different ways. And we have the birth of Yaakov and Esav, or really Esav and Yaakov. A day comes when Yaakov is cooking lentils, and that was the commodity used to purchase the birthright. There's a rabbinic tradition that was the day of passing of Avraham Avinu, and if you do the math, at age 15, this sale took place. And the portion switches from the focus on these 2 brothers, on the twins, very different twins, to a story of Yitzchak. Yitzchak having some difficulty. In other words, due to a famine, he settles in the region of the Philistines in northern Israel. He has issues that relate to wells. He digs wells. The locals claim the right over the wells. He has a lot of agmas nefesh, a lot of pain and sorrow, and on page 132, eventually something takes place in verse 26, where Avimelech reaffirms the treaty and the relationship with the king of the Philistines is improved. Fine. We'll read that in detail, but the portion, of course, continues with the stealing of the blessing, where Esav is supposed to receive some kind of blessing from Yitzchak. The Esav is the one that is supposed to receive it, but Yaakov rips it off with assistance from his mom. And what's interesting is that Esav had these garments that Yaakov was able to wear to fool the father into believing, to fool Yitzchak into believing that it was actually Esav who was walking in. What's fascinating to me is that Esav was able to keep clothes by his mother. According to rabbinic tradition, he's 63. At that, the twins are 63, right? Some mothers, I'm not familiar with those, but some mothers allow their kids to leave things when they're in the home. There are such parents, it seems like. That's what I hear. And that's taking place. He is able to fool him. Esav has a fit. Yaakov escapes. And the story ends with that. But the main focus to understand what is taking place has to be a reading of a verse on page 132. And this is when Esav reaches age 40, he decides to marry 2 women. His first 2 wives. And their names are going to be extremely significant, and we're going to try to analyze their names based on Yitzchak and his personality. So please read carefully verse 34, when Esav, Vayehi Esav, Ben Arba'im Shana. Now this text is presented right before the story of the blessings being ripped off by Yaakov. So when Esav reaches age 40, Va'ikach Isha, he marries a woman by the name of Yehudit, Bat Be'eri. Yehudit, the daughter of Be'eri, who was a Chiti. And we'll see soon, Esav's parents were unhappy with the shidduch. Girl number 2 was Basmat, the daughter of Elon, who was also a Chiti, and they were a source of spiritual rebellion, translated by the Art Scroll, to Yitzchak and Rivka. They're not happy with it. Nevertheless, Esav was going to receive the blessings due to the fact that the father, Yitzchak, had a vision that there should be some kind of partnership, that Yaakov will be the spiritual one and receive those spiritual blessings, and Esav, perhaps with the blessings, with the fact that we will have abundance in the physical realm, he could be a partner of his son. But the names are significant, and we're going to try to understand the names, so that's going to be our mission today. But it's going to take place by going to the top of page 132. I mentioned the wells and fights. They dig wells, and there are fights. Verse 24, okay, you on the top of page 132. Top of page 132, which is chapter 26, verse 24. And Yitzchak is having great difficulty and challenge with the local Philistines. Vayera elav Hashem balaylahu. So in verse 24, Hashem appears to him that night. And he says to him, Vayomer, Anochi, I am Elokei Avraham Avicha, I am the God of your father. And Al Tira, have no fear, fear not. Ki itecha Anochi, I will be with you. Uverachticha, and I'm going to bless you. Now this is not the first time that God appears to him, because when he wants to leave the land of Israel, earlier in this chapter, he wants to leave the land of Israel. And God tells him, listen, you could stay in this land, and I will fulfill my oath that was made to Avraham Avicha. I'm quoting from a verse. Abraham, your father. Okay, so God already spoke to him and mentioned the fact that there was an oath to Abraham, your father. In this verse, God says, I will bless you. Vehirbeti et zaracha, and worry not, I'm going to multiply and increase your offsprings, because ba'avur Avraham, and earlier Avraham is mentioned as Avraham your father, but now suddenly it is Avraham, Avdi, Avraham my servant. So we have to understand the switch. We have to understand this concept of fear. There was fear. If God tells him, fear not, obviously he is fearing something. And then he wakes up in the morning, and how does he deal with this dream, with this vision? It seems like he got the message. And the message was, Va'iven Sham Mizbeach, he builds an altar. This is the first time we find him building an altar. And guess what he does? Vayikra b'shem Hashem, he calls out and he invokes the name of God. Something that we find his dad doing quite often in many, many different locations. Here we find Yitzchak doing it. It was not his cup of tea, cup of coffee. It's not something he would do.
Why isn't the place mentioned?
The place is not mentioned. So we were known from earlier that he's in the Gerar region. In a suburb of the Philistine capital. And he's dealing with them, he's having tsaras with them, he's fighting with them. That's what we have. And he places his tent there. And right after that, right after this act of building an altar, calling out in the name of God, which we have to explain what that means, Vayichru sham avdei Yitzchak be'er, and they were able to dig a well. And right afterwards, right after this event, Avimelech comes and says, listen, I want to make a pact with you. I'm interested in having a shvuah, in oath. I want to have a brit with you, a covenant. Yitzchak does not buy it completely, but at least their tension ends in a very peaceful way, because in verse 31, they take an oath to one another. The relationship is reestablished. And they renamed the place Be'er Sheva. It was already called Be'er Sheva. There seems to be a small switch. But nevertheless, what we have to understand, what we're going to focus on, is the dream. What's God telling him? What's Hashem telling Yitzchak in this dream? What was the message? And he wakes up in the morning and he builds an altar. He calls out in the name of God. What's he trying to achieve with that? And we see, obviously, if you read the first part of the chapter, he is a fellow that is having a lot of tsuras from his shchenim, from his neighbors. And suddenly, after the dream, after the vision, and after the way he acts due to the vision, there is peace. So what does he achieve? What's going on here? Fathers and sons, or children and their parents, there's always a challenge of living in the shadow of a parent. There's always that feeling that, am I as good? Can I be as good? How do I do it? So there are different ways to deal with it. There was, they know the story of a teacher who walks around class asking students, what do you want to be when you're an adult? Or I want a baker, a fireman. And when she comes to one student, and the student is asked, what do you want to be? So the student says, well, it depends. Depends on what, asks the teacher. So the student asks, what's the opposite of a pilot? And what do you mean, what's the opposite of a pilot? He said, what would be the furthest job from a pilot? So the teacher had no clue what exactly the student wants, and he says, a shoemaker. So he says, good, I want to be a shoemaker. And the teacher asks, why? Because my father is a pilot, so I want to be a shoemaker, because that, according to you, is the opposite. Now, the idea behind it is that the easiest way to deal with the challenge of living in a shadow of someone great, the easiest way to deal with it is to find an industry that is very, very different, because you can no longer compare the two. When you start comparing two, and the person has to grow up with this cloud, with this way of thinking that he is not as good as his parents, it could be extremely challenging. If, on the other hand, you're in a different field where no one will ever compare the shoemaker to the pilot, there's safety there. Now, Yitzchak is going to have a very, very different identity than his father. There is no question about it. You can see it from the text. When his father is running around, opening a tent, building altars, calling out. What does it mean to call out in the name of God? It basically means that you build an altar, and you proclaim and you teach, and people would gather around and hear your message and your teaching. And he was busy giving out food, and when you bring food, people come to a lecture. And then at the end of the lecture, he was able to go out, or at the end of the meal, he was able to teach them the lesson of morality, to teach them the importance of believing that there's one God, and he is not going to be satisfied by you offering your children as a korban. That's not what he wants. That's what he was doing, reaching out to humanity, an extrovert. That's what Abraham was all about. We find Yitzchak doing absolutely nothing of that kind. And according to tradition, when we find in the Torah, the God is called the God of Pachad Yitzchak, of the fear of Yitzchak. This is a person that focuses on inner perfection. He is a person who is a carrier of the attribute of justice. He demands perfection from himself, and as a result, due to his personality, expects perfection from others. So to go out and reach out and be that educator, when he knows very well that perhaps he can upgrade the spirituality of his students from 20% to 50%, he sees it 50%, perfect, that's worthless. I'm working on upgrading my 99.9% spirituality. I'm not going to be able to have any success. 50 is garnished. It was a very different personality, a very different attitude. And by the way, it is possible to believe that Avraham encouraged his Yitzchak to go ahead and figure out his own way of serving God. We find God telling Avraham, you know what? You're going to have a future. You're going to have someone that's going to teach your values. And Avraham responds, the only person I have now that is really a partner in this mission of educating humanity is Damesek Eliezer. That's what he says. It's Eliezer from Damascus. Now, why does he have to mention Damesek Eliezer? Meaning, he could have just said Eliezer. God knows exactly where he is from. God knows who Eliezer is. Why mention the Damascus element? So, the rabbis tell us that the word Damesek could be broken down and could refer to the following idea. That when you have a well, and you draw water out of the well to give to those who are in need, standing around, you are a dole. Dole, in even in modern Hebrew, is to draw. Umashke, and you give the drink. Dole umashke. So the rabbis play with the word damesek that it refers and represents this idea of Eliezer, who is dole umashke, who teaches out to the world the messages of his master. Dole umashke mitorat rabo la'acherim. He goes out and he draws. He would tune into Avraham. He would sit there and listen to anything that Avraham would teach, and then he would go out and share with precision what Avraham was teaching others. It was all the insights of Avraham Avinu. So based on that, what Avraham is telling God when he says, the only thing I have is this Eliezer who is a Damascus was a complaint, meaning I don't want someone that will just be there teaching my insights. I want to have a child who has his own personality, his own outlook, and his own way of developing a relationship with God, and his teachings should be different. A good master is not interested in creating robots. A good master doesn't want his students to be his clones. A good master is the one that turns to the disciple, the student, and say, let me see, what are your strengths, what are your abilities, what contribution can you make? Based on your personality, you go out and do ABC. They say, Rav Soloveitchik, there are hundreds of, perhaps even thousands of different Rav Soloveitchiks, meaning if you hear an insight from Rav Soloveitchik from one rabbi, it will be totally different than a different disciple of Rav Soloveitchik. Reason being, he was a real teacher. He was not there claiming that everything you teach has to be based on my philosophy. He believed that you should go ahead and empower the student to figure out what they are about, the way they think, and then you go ahead and have many people with their own identity teaching. A good master doesn't want an Eliezer, who all he is doing is teaching the messages of the Rebbe. They want someone to have independence, think on their own, develop on their own, based on tradition, within the guidelines of tradition. They say in Europe, in Lithuania, there's a city called Kovna. Right? He was from that region. So, not he himself, his parents, you know that. So Kovna had a suburb called Slabotka. It was a suburb of Slabotka, and they established the yeshiva there. And Rabbi Finkel, who was the head of the yeshiva of Slabotka, was known as the alter from Slabotka. And he, very much so, would analyze his students and tell them what to do. And it became, to some extent, like a religion by the students, that if the master says something, and the master who understood the psychology and the way that a specific student would work, the student felt a responsibility of following that path. My grandfather, who became a rabbi in 1929, so he was told by the alter years earlier that he should go into the rabbinate for 40 years. So therefore came 1969, it's it. He was able to hang up. He said, I fulfilled my job. The alter said I should be a rabbi for 40 years. So therefore, mission accomplished. A good teretz for retirement that my Rebbe told me I have to retire. But nevertheless, there was that idea, develop independence. Yitzchak was very, very different than his father. And you could go ahead and claim that he was trying to find his own identity. You could give credit to Avraham, who said, Yitzchak, you do it your way. You don't have to do it my way. When little Yitzchak was watching his father standing there, welcoming dozens of people for a Shabbos meal, or standing out feeding guests who just came in from the wilderness, he had to deal with all kind of people, not just with angels, right? He dealt with humans as well. He would feed them and take care of them. And little Yitzchak was watching, and the father perhaps saw Yitzchak, eyeing and predicting or dreaming of his future doing the same. And Dad says, you do what you feel comfortable doing. Remember, there is a God, the messages are true, but how you go ahead and carry on tradition, you figure out on your own. So one of the two. Yitzchak is very, very different than his father. So if his father is building altars and his father is calling out in the name of God, Yitzchak felt uncomfortable doing it, felt uncomfortable. And believe it or not, he even had a level of fear. Because Mr. Perfection, he was a man, his focus was personal growth. He had an understanding that the human could reach very high spiritual levels by developing himself. So he, being very analytical and being very critical of himself, had a feeling that to go ahead and be like my father, I have to be at a specific level. And if I am not on that level, if I preach, but I'm not really inside of myself on that spiritual level, perhaps I am phony. And perhaps there's a danger there, because to walk into a pagan society and to start preaching about God, they might kill you. So if you believe, and if indeed you are on the right spiritual level, you are protected. He wasn't comfortable with it. He had fear due to his personality and due to his personal belief that perfection is what is demanded from man. That is the Yitzchak personality. Very, very different than his father. Now, it's interesting to note that there are different cultures. If you look at the Jewish world and you look at yeshivot, you see some students, I'm talking, teenagers coming up, products of a yeshiva, age 15, 16, very nice young men. They have a level of discomfort dealing with the people around them. In other words, this is as a result of their culture, not always their personality. Because their focus, the message in a traditional yeshiva would be, focus on your personal growth, focus on yourself. To be someone that reaches out, you have to be on the right spiritual level. So therefore, the outside world is seen to them as something that is beyond them, a different planet, because their whole focus is internal. So for them to interact with the world around them, even saying a hello, or how are you, or looking at someone that might look different than them, could create a challenge, because that is not their focus. Now, does such a philosophy preserve truth? Probably yes. In other words, it's very possible that a student who focuses in such a world, that all it is about is my personal growth and being familiar with the tradition and being able to transmit it to the next generation, odds are that such an institution, such a yeshiva, will preserve religion or preserve their understanding of it in a very precise way. Will they have the ability of reaching out and touching others on the outside? Questionable. On the other hand, there's nothing more inspiring than going to Sobeys on Erev Sukkot, and you see this young Chabad kid, right, maybe 13, 14, offering every single person a lulav and asra. Why is it inspiring? So first of all, for many, and we might be, some of us might have a negative critical view, but one after the other, when you watch them, they are reaching people. One after the other. If you stand there for 3 minutes, you will see them handing it over to at least one, perhaps 2 or 3 people. Very, very inspiring. And they stand there much longer than 3 minutes, correct?
Never a woman, though.
Never a woman. Okay, I'm going to keep my eyes open. Next time I'm staying 5 minutes.
They did.
You see?
Never say never.
You were here at the wrong time.
What was that? Was it between 6 and 7 in the morning? Because I think, anyway. That is inspiring. Now, by the way, it develops their personality. Because suddenly, if at age 13 they could stand and be trained, and they might not naturally have an outgoing personality, but if they are trained, that part of the religion is such that you have to go ahead and hand a lulav and esrog to a stranger, so there's no question that by age 18, they could go ahead and go to China, to some Chabad house where there's no one around, and interact with people. The training is excellent. Now, can you expect scholarship? And again, I'm not questioning it, but can you expect that young student, where the focus was reaching out, can you expect them to be the future educator of a religion that is very, very complex, where there are so many details that you have to remember to preserve religion as is? Well, that's not their focus, right? There are others, and I'm sure within their school as well, that do it. But there's a difference between the person who is focusing on reaching out and the person who understands that there's so much depth we can achieve by reaching in. different personalities. Our philosophy is always that everyone is making their contribution. That the healthy approach to view the diverse nature of our nation is to appreciate what everyone has to offer, to value what everyone is doing, because as a whole, we need both. We all agree that we need those that are only focusing and studying on the text and doing nothing else, but we need those who go ahead and reach out. We need those to go ahead and serve in the army, and those who are actually able to sit and learn day and night and preserve, those should be sitting and learning. We understand that you have to have everything, because one person cannot achieve it all. If you view your identity as part of the Jewish people and everyone's making a contribution, then we could get somewhere. Yitzchak is not Avraham. He is very, very different. He is Mr. Justice, perhaps a little bit of his mommy, right? His mom, Sarah. When it comes to Ishmael not acting a proper way, Avraham's lost. He's Mr. Welcoming. Has to deal with Ishmael. He wasn't capable of making a decision. Who was able to make a decision in that situation? Sarah. So she understood very well where the lines are. And it's very, very possible that when they needed a wife for Yitzchak, who is very much like his mother, what kind of wife do you have to find for him? Someone that's going to balance him. You need someone that can offer water not just to the human, but have sensitivity even for the camels, representing the attribute of chesed. That's very, very possible how we view it. Now, Yitzchak is going to have a wake-up call. So this is Yitzchak's view, his vision, his attitude, his personality, and then he has a wake-up call in the middle of the night while he is sleeping, right? Very unique. He's going to have a vision. And in the vision, God's going to communicate with him and tell him, you know what? I appreciate what you have to offer. I appreciate what you are about. But your attitude of being nothing like your father, doing nothing your father did, is actually wrong. You can't live like that. You have to be, you might not have to do it as much as your father did. I am not demanding that you walk around everywhere and build altars, but there are times that you have to be like your father and call out, build that altar, bring the attention, bring people together and teach the messages. Be like your father, not completely, but it's time to make a change. And Avraham was my Eved. When we talk about an Eved, it relates to the word Avodah. Avodah in the Beit HaMikdash refers to service. Service relates to sacrifices. Sacrifices at that time would mean burning something on an altar and perhaps offering food to people that would come. Having people, strangers, coming together to learn the messages of Avraham Avinu. So God tells him in his dream, number one, fear not. You have this fear that you're not on the level, that you're not capable, that you're not worthy, you're not cut out to be the one teaching those messages and being like your father. Number one, so this is back to verse 24. Vayera elav Hashem balaylahu. And this is after he's having tsaros, he's having difficulty. The Philistines are driving him nuts. He goes out and he digs a well for his family, an extended family to survive. The Philistines take it, one after the other. He is having difficulty. God appears to him. Vayomer in verse 24, Anochi Elokei Avraham Avicha. You should know, he's your father. Al tira, fear not. I will be with you. I will bless you. And the verse ends, Ba'avur, in the merit of Avraham Avdi, my servant. God throws in the servant as well. The servant relates to Avodah. Yitzchak, wake up and build the altar. Wake up and reach out. Call out in the name of God as your father did. Because it is a requirement for everyone not to just focus on themselves. True, there are those that should put the bulk of their time in it, but you cannot ignore the world around you. That's not what Judaism is about. Judaism, the values are about teaching and preaching and reaching out to the world. He wakes up in the morning, verse 25, Vayiven Sham Mizbeach. He builds the altar. And that, meaning he learned the lesson. Vayikra b'shem Hashem, and he calls out and he invokes the name of God. He places a tent there, and if it's a tent next to a place where he's calling out, he is reaching out to humanity. And the verse ends that they were able to dig a well, and this is the well where there were no fights over. And that's what he's learning. That the reason he had those issues is because he is escaping from his father. He is trying not to be his father, but in some ways it is his responsibility to be like him. So the message that Yitzchak learns is that to serve God, there must be the person who declares to reject Avodah Zarah. You have to go ahead and teach others to reject the values of idolatry. To be a Yehudi, we have a rule that whenever the word Yehudi is used, it symbolizes the person. It is a term that's used for those who reject worshiping foreign forces, pagan forces. And that is done by a be'er, wells. When Abraham would dig the wells, what was the idea of the wells? It wasn't just for himself. You supply water to people. You supply water to people, they settle. Where did people settle in the past? In Egypt. Where did everyone live? All by the Nile. You need to have a source of water. Abraham builds a well, he wants to build a city. What were the values that built a city? The values were the values of, there is one God and he wants you to appreciate him. He wants you to enjoy the world, but recognize that there's a higher being, that there's wrong and right. He wanted the values of Avraham that Yitzchak now finally gets, is the Yehudi by the Be'er. Now, Yitzchak has his own personality that does not vanish. He is still that person who is like a perfect sacrifice. He is like the ayil. Remember at the end of Parshat Vayera, when he is offered, where he is actually placed on the altar. Last moment, thank God, Avraham gets a text message from the angel that he should not offer him. What did Avraham take instead? The ram, the ayil, okay? And the ayil was taken, and that elevated the status of that location. That location became for eternity a place where the people of Israel are remembered. We talk Rosh Hashanah about remembrance, and we talk about to remember the Akedah. And when we talk about the Beit HaMikdash, and we talk about the spices and the smells and the aromas that were brought, the Reach Nichoach LaHashem, that ayil that was burnt by Avraham instead of Yitzchak created a tremendous aroma and pleasure for God, because it reminds God on a continuous basis that there is commitment by Avraham and Yitzchak. And that is, of course, a very personal moment. What took place, and you could also, when we mentioned up until this point, that it is a son either escaping his father or a son that was encouraged by his father to find his own path, it is very, very possible that that moment, laying there on the altar, feeling that he is no longer here, that was a moment that changed his life. That his focus was to be that perfect korban. When you would offer a korban, you know that they would spend 4 days checking it to be sure it is unblemished. Now, if a person wants to go ahead and reach out and has to first go through the process of determining that he is unblemished, that his agenda is totally for the sake of heaven, it would be the end of anyone reaching out, right? If you would go ahead and believe that you have to get a perfect rabbi, right? Or a rabbi would have to believe that he has to be perfect to reach out, right? Forget about rabbis, because the reality is that no one is perfect. Doesn't exist. There is an acceptance that Judaism is about growth. Judaism is about improving. And yes, there are flaws that you come to the table with, but that is the human condition, that there are indeed flaws. Yitzchak works very different. The poor guy was a korban. The korban and the message of the korban is perfection. So what's he expecting from himself? What do you expect from that day on? He is Mr. Perfection. He is focusing on growth. He is meditating. He is praying. He is a person who is in a different realm. Perhaps you can understand with that why he doesn't recognize the Esav that he is dealing with. When people, it's interesting to note that there's a lot of, in the news now, in Israel, there's a lot of discussion about what they call chatzerot, courtyards. What does it mean, discussion about courtyards? So if you, one day, anyone here becomes a gadol b'Yisrael, you become a gadol ador, right? You become a gadol ador. So unfortunately, it seems like that gadol ador goes together with something called the courtyard. There are people around you. and they are the ones that share your philosophy with people, and they have a publication, a newspaper that shares your ideology. That's how it works. Now, quite often, if not close to always, what's taking place is that the people around this Gadol Hador are the ones that are really establishing the policy, and they get what they want, meaning they'll go to the Gadol Hador, present to him facts, perhaps not in the purest form, and the quote-unquote psak they are going to get is going to be based on how they present it to him. And that's how Judaism works, unfortunately. In other words, that's why, halachically speaking, there's absolutely no obligation to go ahead and follow what a Gadol Hador says if you did not hear it from him. If it was published or printed, if you heard it from him, that's one thing. But if it is heard from someone else, or published or printed, it is extremely questionable. That's a reality that exists. We have a warning about these things developed already in the 1930s. In the 1930s, there was a desire to develop an Agudas Yisrael, a world Agudas Yisrael, like a world organization that people should know how to think and what to do based on the Agudas Yisrael. But there was a rabbi in Vilna, and his name was Reb Chaim Ozer Guzensky. And Reb Chaim Ozer says, I am extremely against these organizations. He said, why? Because these organizations are going to publish opinions, but the opinions are not going to be of the Gadol, they're going to be of the secretary there. He warned it. And if there's anyone that's a Gadol, he was able to predict the future to the T. In other words, he understood very well how things are going in the Jewish world. So that's a major problem. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was once asked, who are the people in his chatzer, in his courtyard? Who are the people that surround him? And he responded, "B'chatzer sheli, in my courtyard, yesh rak chatulim. There are only cats. That's what I have in my courtyard. I don't have people running." That was a different, different generation and a different type of person. But there's always that danger, and therefore you have to be very suspicious whenever you read something that a great person said. How was it presented to him? And I could give you, believe me, I could give you a lot of evidence of those things happening in the past. It's been accelerated over the past few years. It's becoming more and more, and now already people are picking up. In other words, beforehand it was heresy to say what I'm saying now. Now already it's becoming accepted. With that, Yitzchak is a very spiritual person. He is a person that is growing. He's in a different realm, he's in a different world. He has a Esav who is able to fool him. There's no question about it. That's the message of this week's portion. He is fooled by Esav. Why is he fooled by Esav? So the rabbis say, Ki tzayid befiv. Literally that means that Yitzchak likes the son Esav because he would give him a good meal. That's the literal explanation. The rabbis say that doesn't mean that. It means that Esav would fool him. Tzayid also means to fool. Esav would fool his dad. Esav would walk into his father and say, Dad, I have a shaila. So Yitzchak would be all happy. Esav out in the field, but he still asks halachic shaila. He says, what's your shaila? I need to tithe my salt. My salt. How do you tithe salt? And the father would say, listen, don't worry about it, you don't have to tithe it, but he would have tremendous nachas from the fact that Esav was so committed that he didn't just tithe his grain and grapes and oil and perhaps his vegetables, but even salt, which is not required. So that's what Esav was able to do, that when the dad is in such a on such a spiritual level, he is that korban, he is that sacrifice, he's in a different realm. Unfortunately, the result is that he could have an Esav fooling him. And that's perhaps the pattern that's established, that sometimes we do have Gdolei Yisrael that are extremely great people, but they can have Esavs around them, right? Esavs, people that have a negative agenda, people that are very, very ambitious in a world that does not create opportunity for them. So the ambition comes out in a very negative way. That's a reality, and that's the way to read the news, not that there's any mitzvah to do it. Bottom line is, Esav wants to fool his father. And he wants to fool his father, and now, at the end of this chapter, he knows that there are two things that his dad values. His dad values his own philosophy, his philosophy of being the ayil, the ram, which creates a bosem, which creates a pleasant aroma, which is like a korban. He knows that his father's like a korban. But he also learned that his father now went through some kind of awakening in his sleep, where he understood that you have to be like Avraham Avinu as well. that you have to be a person who declares, deny avodah zarah, be a Yehudi, and the essence and the term is used to deny avodah zarah, be a Yehudi and declare that by the well, by the be'er. So that is Esav's new agenda, to fool his dad into believing that he is a carrier and he appreciates those two values. So now we can go ahead and understand at the end of this chapter, at the end of page 132, chapter 26, verse 34, when we're going to go ahead and analyze the names of these wives that he brings into the picture, we can understand what these names symbolize, or what we are being told here by the text. Vayehi Esav, verse 34. He reaches the age of 40. Vayikach Isha, and he takes woman number one. Her name is Yehudit Bat Be'eri. The first one is Yehudit Bat Be'eri, a woman that symbolizes this idea of denying avodah zarah, do it by the well, declare it to many. So this is the woman that he marries to go ahead and declare and tell dad, tell his father, Yitzchak, worry not, I am a carrier and I appreciate the values of Avraham that you recently learned in your dream. And the second wife was Basmat. The word Basmat comes from the word Bosem. Bosem means a pleasant fragrance, like a perfume. And we always talk about that it is a nachat ruach, that it creates a pleasant aroma for God. Korbanot create a pleasant aroma for God. The second wife symbolizes Yitzchak's own personal journey. It's a personal journey that began, or perhaps was accelerated by the events of him laying on the altar, where he was burnt through the ayil, through the ram that his father took. So therefore, wife number two, that symbolizes the message, and Esav declaring to his dad, I really, really value and appreciate what you are about, and therefore wife number two is Basmat, the bosem, the aroma and the perfume of Bat Eilon, Eilon, the Ayil Acher Nechaz Basfach, which relates to the ram and the experience of Yitzchak and what he went through. So this could give us an understanding of what's happening to Yitzchak, how he dealt with the new realities and with the fact that he was able to bring in the values of his father, and how Esav continues his agenda of fooling his dad, which in essence he did succeed to some extent, because dad at least wanted to give him the blessings until Yaakov got dressed up and took them away and was on the run, as we'll see next week. Thank you, everyone. I wish a safe trip to my mother, who is leaving us to Baltimore.